Testing, testing, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Chairman's microphone. Did you get me? Okay, let me do it. Standing by for witness. Witness, microphone, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Sound check, room 1334, Longworth. Sound check, room 1334, Longworth, okay. Sound check, room 1334, Longworth. Got it?
The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget hearing on the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook. Bear with me. In the congressional budget process, we often refer to this annual report as a baseline because it provides a benchmark when considering the effects of policy options and determining funding levels. That being said, receipt of the baseline each year means that the process of writing the budget resolution in this committee can begin in earnest. While the CBO's report is typically published earlier in the calendar year, we knew that this year's would be delayed in order to adjust for the recently enacted tax reform law. However, regardless of when it is released and updated each year, CBO's baseline is important because it sheds light on our nation's current fiscal challenges and guides us in mapping out a sustainable path for the future. Assuming the continuation of current law, CBO's baseline offers projections of federal spending, revenue surpluses or deficits, and debt. CBO's baseline also includes a forecast of key economic indicators as well as detailed budget estimates for specific programs and categories of spending. We are joined today by Dr. Keith Hall, who is the Director of the Congressional Budget Office, and we appreciate his attendance at yet another hearing involving the CBO. And Dr. Hall, we appreciate you being here today. Before we welcome his comments and then begin in earnest our question and answer period, I'd like to yield for some opening statements from the ranking member, the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director Hall. Thank you for appearing before us once again. This year's Economic and Budget Outlook offers a contrasting story. CBO presents us with an optimistic short-term economic forecast, one that you note is more optimistic than that of the Federal Reserve and most private forecasters, along with a very disturbing longer-term budget forecast that shows the deficit reaching $1 trillion 2 or 3 years earlier than in your previous estimates. The two, of course, are not unrelated. Congress has provided a large jolt of economic stimulus with tax and spending bills this winter. We would be better off if the other side had been as willing to support economic stimulus 9 years ago, when it was urgently needed, as they are today. But we are where we are, and these bills are giving the economy some juice today. But they are also increasing our current and long-term deficits. The tax bill focused its benefits on the wealthy and corporations. The Treasury Secretary and many congressional Republicans kept insisting that the bill would pay for itself. No credible source has ever agreed, and your report confirms the obvious. The tax bill doesn't pay for itself. Indeed, its economic feedback doesn't even quite pay for the additional interest spending needed to finance it. The numbers in your report indicate that if we hadn't passed the tax bill, the deficit outlook for 2018 to 27 would have actually improved since your June estimate. Instead, it's $1.6 trillion worse. We are getting some economic boost from the tax bill, and while that will be welcome, it will also be short-lived. The boost is very front-loaded. Indeed, your report indicates that the tax bill will actually reduce our economic growth rate beginning in 2025. I also worry that the benefits, as short as they may be, will not be broadly shared, that they will primarily help those who are already doing well at the expense of everyone else, just like the tax cuts themselves. I think it's important to point out that this picture assumes we will not have a recession for a decade, that the Fed will be able to raise rates just enough to keep the economy from overheating over the next 4 years, then drop them just enough from 2022 to 2026 to engineer a soft landing. I hope you're right about that. But I don't think we can count on having the current expansion last nearly twice as long as the longest previous one in our history. And a recession would surely mean a weaker economy and larger deficits than you forecast. That's a reality congressional Republicans and President Trump are pretending we don't live in. They have succeeded in making the deficit worse. They are now trying to use the deficit as an excuse to make massive cuts to programs vital to American families, including Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The balanced budget amendment we are debating on the floor today would force those cuts. It won't pass, but I think we can count on our colleagues to keep trying. After all, it's what we've seen for decades. It happens every time a Republican president replaces a Democratic one in the White House. Ronald Reagan cut taxes, sent deficits skyrocketing, and unsuccessfully sought to slash the safety net. The second President Bush cut taxes, turned record surpluses into record deficits, and unsuccessfully sought to cut Social Security. Even President Nixon inherited a surplus that immediately disappeared. It's no surprise that we see the deficit soaring again now that Republicans have taken full control over the federal budget. Some things never change. The only thing Republicans in Washington like better than complaining about deficits and debt is increasing deficits and debt. It's part of a three-step process that we've seen time and time again. First, they cut taxes primarily for the wealthy. Second, they shed crocodile tears and raise the alarm about the rising deficits that they just worsened. Third, they insist that the deficit is purely a spending problem and push for extreme cuts in programs that are vital to American families. I suspect we'll hear at least some of my colleagues pursue steps 2 and 3 today. But before we get to that, Director Hall, I look forward to hearing your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. As noted earlier, Dr. Keith Hall, Director of the Congressional Budget Office, is in front of you today. The committee, sir, has received your opening statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You'll have 5 minutes to deliver oral remarks, and then I'm sure that the members that are gathered here today and those that will arrive at some point during this hearing will be anxious to engage you in a question and answer period. So we're going to yield the floor to you for 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Congressional Budget Office's most recent analysis of the outlook for the budget and the economy. My statement summarizes CBO's new baseline budget projections and economic forecast, which the agency released on Monday. In the Congressional Budget Office's baseline projections, which incorporate the assumption that current laws governing taxes and spending generally remain unchanged, the federal budget deficit grows substantially over the next few years. Later on, between 2023 and 2028, it stabilizes in relation to the size of the economy, though at a high level. As a result, federal debt is projected to be on a steadily rising trajectory throughout the coming decade, approaching 100% of gross domestic product by 2028. Projected deficits over the 2018 to 2027 period have increased markedly since we issued our last budget and economic projections in June of 2017. The increase stems primarily from tax and spending legislation enacted since then, especially the 2017 Tax Act, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018. In our economic projections, which underlie our budget projections, inflation-adjusted GDP, or real GDP, expands by 3.3% this year and by 2.4% in 2019. Most of this growth is driven by consumer spending and business investment, but federal spending also contributes a significant amount this year. Growth of real GDP exceeds the growth of real potential GDP over the next 2 years. This marked cyclical path in real GDP will occur in large part because the recent legislation provides significant fiscal stimulus at a time when there's very little slack in the economy. Those effects, as well as the larger federal budget deficits resulting from the new laws, exert upward pressure on interest rates and prices. During the 2020 to 2026 period, those factors, along with the slower growth in federal outlays and the expiration of reductions in personal income tax rates, dampen economic growth. After 2026, economic growth is projected to rise slightly, matching the growth rate of potential output by 2028. Between 2018 and 2028, real actual output and real potential output alike are projected to expand at an average annual rate of 1.9%. In our forecast, the growth of potential GDP is the key determinant of the growth of actual GDP through 2028, because actual output is very near its potential level now and is projected to be near its potential level at the end of the period. Potential output is projected to grow more quickly than it has since the start of the 2007 and 2009 recession, as the growth of productivity increases to nearly its average over the next 25 years. Nonetheless, potential output is projected to grow more slowly than it did in early decades, held down by slower growth of the labor force. In our projections, the effects of the 2017 Tax Act on incentives to work, save, and invest raise real potential GDP throughout the 2018 to 2028 period. Over the same period, the Tax Act is projected to boost the level of real GDP by an average of 0.7% and non-farm payroll employment by an average of 1.1 million jobs. Our current economic projections differ from those that we made in June 2017 in a number of ways. The most significant is that potential and actual real GDP are projected to grow more quickly over the next few years. Projected output is greater because of the recently enacted legislation, data that has become available after our previous economic projections were completed, and improvements in our analytical methods. Over the next decade, the unemployment rate is lower in our current projections than our previous ones, particularly during the next few years. Then economic stimulus boosts demand for labor. Also, both short and long-term interest rates are projected to be higher on average from 2018 to 2023. Turning to the budget projections, we estimate that the 2018 deficit will total $804 billion, $139 billion more than the $665 billion shortfall recorded in 2017. In our projections, budget deficits continue increasing after 2018 as deficits accumulate. Debt held by the public rises from 78% of GDP, or $16 trillion, at the end of 2018 to 96% of GDP, or $29 trillion, by 2018. That percentage would be the largest since 1946 and well more than twice the average over the next few decades. For the 2018 to 2027 period, we now project a cumulative deficit that is $1.6 trillion larger than the $10.1 trillion that we anticipated in June. Projected revenues are lower by $1 trillion. Projected outlays are higher by $0.5 trillion. Laws enacted since June 2017, above all the three mentioned earlier, are estimated to make the cumulative deficit $2.7 trillion larger than previously projected between 2018 and 2017. However, revisions to our economic projections caused us to reduce our estimate of the cumulative deficit by $1 trillion over the same period, mainly because of our expectations of faster growth in the economy. I appreciate the invitation to testify today and about CBO's budget and economic outlook, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, once again for your appearance and for your opening remarks. And now we're going to begin our Q&A with you. Dr. Hall, this is the first hearing we're having with you since the conclusion of the CBO oversight hearing series. In the course of those 5 hearings, the committee expressed concerns about the CBO's level of transparency and its interactions with outside organizations in the course of developing projections and analysis. In what ways has CBO responded to those concerns in the budget and economic outlook that you present today? And then I'll follow up by asking, would you characterize the work that you've done in this product fundamentally showing your work on the baseline? So
Sure.
Help us understand where you are in the area of transparency.
Sure. Well, one of the things we did, of course, when we talked about our economic projection, we did put that in context of other economic projections around. So we compared it to Blue Chip, we compared it to the Federal Reserve and some of those things. And then one thing we did that I thought has been particularly helpful already is when we estimated the impact of the Tax Act. One of the things we focused on in Appendix B was we focused on how we formulated our economic impact of the Tax Act, how we incorporated that. So we spent a lot of time in Appendix B going through great detail of how we saw the economic impact working out. And we produced a table comparing our estimate of the economic impact with estimates of the 8 other groups or individuals that did a comparable job of trying to estimate the effect of the Tax Act.
In the CBO's budget outlook, you project mandatory spending will reach 15+% of GDP by the end of the budget window in 2028. By that point, your budget outlook projects mandatory spending plus net interest payments will be 77% of the federal budget. Talk a little bit about how the composition of the federal budget in terms of mandatory spending versus discretionary spending, and how it's changed down through the last several decades. In other words,
Sure.
how these proportions have basically flipped from, say, 50 years ago.
Right. Well, for example, in 1968, mandatory outlays were something like 6% of GDP, and discretionary outlays were something like 13%. Discretionary was much larger. Right now, mandatory outlays total about, as you say, 12–13% of GDP, but discretionary outlays are now only about 6% of GDP. So mandatory outlays have completely overtaken discretionary outlays. And in our 10-year forecast, that trend is only going to continue. Discretionary outlays are going to continue to fall as a share of GDP, and mandatory outlays are going to grow significantly. So they're becoming, we're getting to see a very, very different picture of how the federal government spends money. And one aspect of that I think is important is net interest is going to become a very large share of federal spending going forward, hitting a number that's over 3% of GDP in the next 10 years, which is going to be higher than total spending on either defense or non-defense discretionary spending. Either one of those it will now be overtaken by net interest going forward.
One of my takeaways in the outlook is the fact that discretionary spending, and I'm addressing what we just talked about in a little different way here, that discretionary spending in the aggregate numbers goes up over the 10-year window, as one would expect it might, but its share, its percentage of GDP actually goes down. So isn't that another way of saying that the challenges, the fiscal challenges facing the United States right now is more complicated on the federal or on the mandatory side, the autopilot spending that this Congress provides every year for big programs, and less to do with what's happening on the discretionary budget?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think my ranking member is going to defer his questions, as he traditionally does, so we're going to go straight into member questions, and I'm going to yield first to the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome Dr. Hall for being here to talk about the report. I want to ask you if you can explain how CBO treats the cost-sharing reduction payments in the baseline, and along with that, is CBO doing this in full compliance with the Section 257 of the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, commonly known as the Graham-Rudman?
Sure. Well, the cost-sharing reductions used to be paid for with direct payments, and that's now ended. And what's happened is, in reality what's happened is insurance companies have had the ability to raise their premiums on silver plans to compensate for the lack of direct payments for the CSRs. In fact, I think we're projecting something like an increase in premiums of about 10%. And so in our forecast, we have the CSRs paid for by these higher premiums, which are then subsidized by the federal government. And those subsidies are sort of taking place of the direct payments on the CSRs. And so the CSR entitlement is paid for in our forecast. It's just paid for a different way that reflects the reality of what's going on.
So just to make sure that I understand completely and to clarify, does this mean that the CBO continues to treat CSRs as an entitlement obligation in the baseline in accordance with the law as it's stated before in this committee?
It does. It is an entitlement in our baseline, and we have it paid for in our baseline.
And then my final piece of this is, what is the benefit of CBO reflecting the entitlement obligation through the premium tax credit? And does this show the American public a more realistic picture of our fiscal situation?
Well, absolutely. And we're required to show that it's paid for, and it is paid for, but in reality, it is being paid for through increased subsidies from higher premiums. So it's reflecting the reality, and again, we are describing, I think, accurately how the CSRs are operating and being paid for.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Jeffries, New York.
Thank the distinguished chairperson as well as the distinguished ranking member for yielding. Good morning, Dr. Hall. You were asked earlier today about mandatory outlays. Is that correct?
Yes.
And mandatory outlays primarily include Social Security and Medicare, correct?
That's right.
So when some folks in this town talk about reducing mandatory outlays, that's Washington speak, as Mick Mulvaney might say, for cutting Social Security and Medicare. True?
Right. Most of the increase in mandatory spending is keeping up with the aging population and the scheduled payments out of Social Security and Medicare.
Okay. Now, before becoming the director of the CBO, you served as the chief economist for President George W. Bush, correct?
Yes,
And you were chosen for your current role by congressional Republicans in 2015, is that right?
yes.
Okay. So according to CBO's new baseline budget projections, remind me again, how large is the 2018 deficit projected to be?
It's projected to be $804 billion this year.
Okay, that's under Republican-controlled House, Senate, and presidency, correct?
Yes.
Now, how does that estimate compare with last year's level?
It is a significant increase over last year, our estimate last year for 2018, but it's a significant increase since last year. It was like 665 last year. It's now 804 billion.
Okay, so let me try and get an understanding of what accounts for that significant increase. Now, I think in your testimony you said that a $194 billion reduction in projected revenues accounts for much of that difference. Is that right?
Yes.
And that reduction in revenues is mainly because of the effects of last year's so-called Republican tax reform bill. Is that right?
That's correct.
And according to the CBO's new budget and economic outlook, the Republican tax bill increases the projected deficit over the next 10 years by about $1.9 trillion. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, we're going to hear a lot of talk on the floor today about the notion of confronting this existential $20 trillion debt that we face, and certainly that's enormous. I'm trying to get an understanding of how we arrived at that point. Is it fair to say that part of that debt results from a failed war in Iraq that occurred under a Republican administration?
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize the war, but certainly spending spending on the conflicts has been a part of the budget.
Okay, and we also had what I would call a unnecessarily prolonged conflict in Afghanistan. Several of us were just there. Our troops are doing a phenomenal job, but 16, 17 years is an incredibly long period of time. Would part of that $20 trillion debt be accounted for by the war in Afghanistan?
Yes, it would.
Okay, and that war, of course, unnecessarily prolonged by going into Iraq, occurring under a Republican administration. Now, would the debt that we confront now in part be accounted for by the 2001 Bush tax cuts?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that plays into it, but I think it did have a negative impact on the deficit.
And a negative impact on the deficit could also be attributed to the 2003 Bush tax cuts. Is that correct?
I believe so. I haven't looked at those numbers lately, but.
And it also seems to me that the economy, which collapsed in 2008, perhaps because of this theory of Republican financial deregulation, but I know you won't characterize that one way or the other, but the collapse of the economy in 2008 contributed in some measure to the debt and the financial situation that we find ourselves in right now. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, there's a nice stark statistic I can throw at you. Is the debt in 2007 was about 35%, the accumulated debt of GDP, and in just 5 years it doubled to about 75% of GDP over that time period.
Okay, and then the icing on this cake that has been given to us by my good friends on the other side of the aisle seems to be the $2 trillion in additional debt to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and famous in a way that was totally unnecessary given the state of our economy at this moment. And so I know my friends on the other side of the aisle, in good conscience, have a different perspective, but it's really hard to be lectured about fiscal and financial restraint given all of what we just detailed that has taken place over the last 18 years. I yield back.
Mr. McClintock, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd remind my colleague that the deficit annually exceeded $1 trillion in the Obama-Pelosi era, and the national debt doubled under that administration. but that does not excuse the deficit numbers and projections that we are seeing today. I have also tried to educate my friends over the years to the fact that debts and taxes are really the same thing. A deficit and a tax are the only two possible ways to pay for spending. This is driven by spending. A deficit is simply a future tax. We borrow now and pay it back out of future taxes, but it is all driven by spending. My greatest fear for our country is that our spending-driven debt and our annual deficits are setting the stage for a debt spiral that could well lead to a sovereign debt crisis. We've already seen years of irresponsible fiscal policy having cost Puerto Rico access to the credit market, which has left it absolutely helpless to respond to emergencies when it was struck by natural disasters. Mr. Hall, are we setting the stage for a debt spiral when the capital market begins assessing higher interest rates to compensate for higher risk?
Yeah, the difficulty in that is knowing how much is too much, but I think that we've accumulated a lot of debt. We've increased the risk of a debt spiral, of a financial...
Now, about 5 years ago, Standard & Poor's downgraded our AAA credit rating for the first time in history, did it not?
It did.
How are credit markets assessing our current situation?
Well, it's hard to know how to characterize that, but that is, I think, the right thing to focus on, because if the U.S. debt gets sufficiently high and we seem to show insufficient resolve to fix it, then it can affect the willingness of credit markets to lend the federal government money without a premium.
And we don't know when that is going to occur, but we are quite certain on the path that we are now on, it will occur.
Yes, I think we've characterized, and I still would characterize the path as unsustainable.
Now, if Treasury yields begin to rise due to market concern over our level of debt and our inability and unwillingness to manage that debt, what does that do to our interest costs?
We can raise our interest costs significantly, and you know our forecast already has really high interest costs at some point in the future. That could raise it significantly.
Now, we're already paying, both for public and intergovernmental debt, about $475 billion just to rent the money we've already spent, are we not?
That's right.
What does a 1% increase in the interest rate do to our interest costs annually?
You know, we haven't worked up that rule of thumb number, but it raises it significantly.
Is it roughly $200 billion a year?
Yeah, I think that's what we worked out last year. It should probably be about the same.
So a 1% increase in interest rates this year would add another $200 billion to our interest costs, even if we balance the budget this year.
That's right, and I would say in terms of the uncertainty in our forecast, that's one of the biggest ones, because
now,
that interest
a
has
debt
huge
spiral
impact.
occurs when the market begins raising interest rates. Our interest costs balloon accordingly. Since we have to borrow that money as well, the risk goes up, the Treasury yield goes up, and we enter a debt spiral. Is that correct?
That would be the...
What are our policy options at that point?
They're pretty tough. They're much more draconian than anything we faced, I think, maybe ever, if that happened.
Is Venezuela right now going through a sovereign debt crisis?
I believe so. I don't know that much about Venezuela's situation, but there are countries like Venezuela who've gone through this.
Well, I think history is screaming this warning at us that countries that bankrupt themselves simply aren't around very long. Now, a lot's been said about mandatory spending, but doesn't the Budget Act give Congress expedited powers, streamlined powers to deal with mandatory spending?
I'm not an expert in that, so I'm going to have to pass on that one. I don't know.
Well, does the budget, the budget adopted by Congress sets discretionary and mandatory spending levels, and then triggers a reconciliation bill, which gives us expedited, streamlined powers to adjust any statutes to conform to those mandatory budget levels. But that requires a budget to be in place. What effect on our ability to deal with this looming crisis is our failure even to produce a budget this year?
Well, certainly the uncertainty is not efficient for the federal government, and certainly for expectations going forward. I think that one of your concerns is a valid one, that a lot of our ability to function depends upon people's confidence in our ability to handle the deficit.
And we don't even have a plan to do so at this point, and certainly have shown no inclination.
None that I've heard.
Thank you.
Mr. Boyle, Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you to the chairman and ranking member, and thank you, Dr. Hall, not just for testifying, but your work. But I also want to say for everyone at the Congressional Budget Office, it is incredibly important in any time that we have a nonpartisan agency to simply call the balls and strikes without partisan interference. But I think especially in these times, the work the CBO does is vital. So thank you, and to everyone at CBO. Last year, at a number of town halls I held in my district, I predicted that the fiscal and budgetary plan of the majority was in two parts. First was to push through a massive tax cut, which they ultimately did to the tune of $1.9 trillion. And to put that into perspective, the Obama-era stimulus, back when the worldwide economy was in the Great Recession, that some on the other side complained wildly about for its enormous size, that was under $1 trillion. So the tax cut that was just planned was actually double the size of the Obama stimulus. And bear in mind something that is often forgotten, half of the Obama stimulus was a tax cut. Only half of it was in fact spending. Part two of the majority's plan, though, after spiking the deficit and the debt to unsustainable rates, is to come back and say, my God, we have a deficit problem. We have a debt problem. It must be because of out-of-control spending. And then, of course, the area to target are the two biggest drivers of our spending, Social Security and Medicare. Part one of that plan has already happened, and I fear that 2018 will be, as Speaker Ryan put it, about quote-unquote entitlement reform, which is essentially part two of that plan. Now, on to this deficit and debt. There have been previous periods, as one of the speakers on the other side pointed out, where our deficit has exceeded $1 trillion. They did in the Great Recession. You also saw in the 2001, 2002 early part of the George W. Bush era, a massive tax cut, which spiked the deficit and took us from a few straight years of surpluses to deficits. But at least in those last two examples, the economy had fallen into recession. We had, of course, the Great Recession beginning in December 2007, though no one knew at the time that recession had started in December 2007. Everyone knew it by the fall of 2008. And in 2001, the economy also went into recession. What really concerns me is the fact that in an era of an unemployment rate of almost 4%, in an era of growth, not recession, that we are already exceeding, as we will next year, $1 trillion in deficit. I ask you, what tools will be at our disposal when the next recession hits? Because sure enough, just as we know the sun will rise tomorrow, we know that there will be another recession yet to come, and that this economic growth cycle of approximately 8 to 9 years now will inevitably end, and we will enter into recession. And if we already have a $1 trillion deficit when that happens, what tools will be at our disposal in order to inject stimulus into the economy?
Well, you're focused on something that I think is really important, is we have deficit and debt at this time period when there's essentially no slack in the economy. There's no recession going on. This would be a time where one could run a surplus and try to pay for debt that's been accumulated during the last recession. But we're not in that position. And if you think about what happened with the Great Recession, I think I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, debt doubled from 35% of GDP, which was already considered to be a high level, to 75% in just 5 years. So one of the real worries going forward is exactly what you described. If we go into an economic downturn, the tools available for Congress and everybody else to deal with it will be much more limited than they have been in the past. And I think that should be a real concern.
Thank you. I yield back the remaining 25 seconds of my time. Thank
Mr.
you.
Woodall, Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hall, for being here. Dr. Hall, I want to pick up where my colleague left off. You said in these more robust economic times, these are times where we could be running a surplus. I have your economic outlook that you just published. I have the one from last April. I have the one from last January. Which one should I be looking at where you were forecasting America's economic future and you saw those surpluses in the numbers?
Well, under current law, it's been quite a long time since current law pointed towards surpluses.
Well, let me make sure I understand then. If these are the times where we should be running surpluses, but no look that you've taken in your tenure at CBO has us running surpluses, what tools are there then to get us from where we are to the surpluses that you think we should be achieving?
What I was trying to suggest is not that we should be running a surplus. I don't want to offer advice like that, but if you're going to run a surplus, and you're going to run a surplus to deal with the debt, the time to do it would be when your economy is in full force, it's functioning near its potential.
Undeniably, that's true. I'm thinking about what are the tools to make that happen. I heard one of my friends on the other side talk about spending and that we didn't have a spending problem. What I'm looking at the CBO reports, and I look at taxation as a percent of GDP, certainly we've just undergone a tax cut, but all of your previous reports suggested to me that the level of taxation in America was already higher than the historical norm. Have I been reading your historical reports accurately?
No, yeah, you have, and in our projection right now, we have the
Absolutely.
revenue levels going.
I saw that in the appendix. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is if the CBO is reporting that we have been experiencing record high levels of taxation in this country, way above the historical norm, that we're experiencing a sound economy in ways that you would expect this to be the time to dig us out of any hole that we've been in. I'm just trying to think what other tools are available to us, and I can't think of many, and I was hoping you might, in your expertise, have some other ideas.
Sure. Well, in a sense, the tools are three, right? You can reduce spending, you can increase revenues, you can try to grow the economy, but I don't think growing the economy is going to make enough of a difference on its own. And I think it's such a big problem, you need to think about it broadly.
Well, I appreciate your saying that, and I appreciate all the kind words that you have received for your leadership and for your organization. I think you're exactly right. If we're experiencing record high taxation, experiencing more record high taxation, probably not the best tool in the toolbox. Dealing with spending, on the other hand, is an important thing to do. We can demonize it all we want to, but you can't demonize deficit spending and reducing spending simultaneously. What I want to also follow up on is folks applauded your role as the nonpartisan scorekeeper, which I value. But I also noticed in your response to the chairman in about transparency, you made a note of other institutions that were also looking at economic prognostication and how you compared to them. If we were to have the Federal Reserve economists sitting beside you this morning, would you think that would be a partisan analysis they would be sharing with us, or would you put that in the nonpartisan analysis also?
My experience is that they're nonpartisan. They're very solid nonpartisan.
Now, what if we brought in one of the big Wall Street macroeconomic analysis groups? Would that then be a partisan analysis, or would they also give us a nonpartisan view?
Probably nonpartisan. It sort of depends. But
So you would say that while we might all recognize the importance of a nonpartisan analysis, that finding nonpartisan analysis isn't a particularly difficult thing to do. We do have institutions across this country, including the CBO, perhaps even led by the CBO, but institutions across this country that provide that same high-quality analysis and effort to do it in a nonpartisan way.
right, yeah, and certainly we offer more than just an economic forecast because we're doing the whole baseline. But we do. There are other places, and we do look at them, actually. We do compare our numbers to make sure that we're not too out of line and understand if we are a little out of line, that we're confident in what we're forecasting.
Thank you very much for your work on this product and for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Jayapal, Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Hall, thank you so much for being with us again, and thank you for all the work that you and your staff do. I, too, wanted to echo some of the comments that Mr. Boyle made. I'm troubled by some of the statements that we heard last year as our Republican colleagues attempted to push through a tax plan that really benefited only the wealthiest in the country, and tried to say that it actually paid for itself. And I just want to read some of the quotes that we heard. So President Trump's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, said we can pay for the entire tax cut through growth. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin agreed the plan will pay for itself. Senator John Thune said that even a modest amount of economic growth could cover the cost of this bill. And White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney went so far as to say that he thinks it, quote, actually generates money. Director Hall, does this bill, do the tax cuts pay for themselves in your analysis?
No, our estimate is that they increase the deficit by almost $1.9 trillion over the next 10 years.
So the tax cuts increase the deficit by almost $1.9 trillion over the next 10 years. And do you think that we will be in a position where there's any level of sustained growth that, in your analysis, that would somehow mitigate that? Your analysis accounts for that, obviously, but tell us about the growth assumptions. Maybe that's a better way to state the question.
Well, sure. And really, there are kind of two different growth things going on. The Tax Act in particular made some changes that encourage investment, encourage capital deepening, and we think that that did in fact contribute to potential GDP, which is sort of the supply side view. And we do have an increase in potential GDP throughout the 10-year period, and probably some increase after that. But also at the same time, a lot of the Tax Act and actually the other two bills, the Bipartisan Budget Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act, provided a lot of stimulus. So you have some increase in potential, but you have a lot of stimulus, and that stimulus is going to push growth above its potential for a while. And while that's good in the short run, the fact that it's above potential is going to cause pressure, going to increase pressure on inflation and interest rates, and we think what's going to happen is the Fed's going to react, raise interest rates faster. Interest rates are going to go up faster. So we're going to then go through a bit of a cycle. After this strong growth from stimulus, that's going to come down, and we're looking for a soft landing to get us back towards potential. So we go through this sort of cycle now.
So for people who are listening who may not be as familiar with the numbers as you are, that means that you estimated, I think it was 3.4 or 3.5% for this year. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then you brought it down to a much lower level for the following years. So in other words, it's not generating sustained growth in the economy, and the result of that is this $1.9 trillion deficit. So let me ask you another question sort of related to growth. Did you factor in any effects of a restrictive immigration policy?
No, our assumptions on the level of immigration has been pretty much the same.
So if we were to pass bills that the other side has been pushing that would significantly restrict immigration policy to this country, what would happen to growth?
Well, it depends on what's done exactly, but one of the things
let's say we cut legal immigration by 25 million over the next 5 decades, which is the proposal that Chairman Goodlatte has put on the floor.
Well, one of the concerns we would have, one of the possible outcomes would be a lowering of the labor supply. Right, and it's part of what this, our near-term projection is pretty high now because we have the labor supply increasing pretty significantly, labor force participation going up. That would potentially have the other effect where it would lower the labor supply, and it could restrict our ability to produce.
And so could significantly increase our deficits because it could significantly decrease our growth. Let me ask you this. If we were, I said last year, as Mr. Boyle did, that the plan here is to first transfer trillions of dollars of wealth to the wealthiest. You don't have to comment on that, through the tax cut. Second, balloon the deficit, which is what's happened, $1.9 trillion deficit, the majority of which is because of this tax cut. And then third, use that as an argument to cut spending on programs that I consider earned benefit programs like Social Security, programs like Medicare. There are other options besides that. What would happen, for example, if we raise the cap on Social Security? And you have just 8 seconds, and I know the chairman's very certain about these things.
It would generate some more income, and revenue would go up. We have an exact estimate. I don't have it in my mind, but we have some a document called Options for Reducing the Deficit, and we do go through that scenario.
So there's lots of opportunities to do things that don't involve cutting Social Security, even though that's certainly what sometimes the majority seems to be focused on, is cutting Social Security.
Right, though I do say just in general, sometimes the effect of raising that limit gets exaggerated. It does have an impact, but it's not a
Fair
solution.
enough. Thank you.
Let the record reflect that I did give her a chance to throw one more question in.
You are
even
always
after we
very
went to-
generous with me, Mr. Chairman, I have to say that.
Thank you. Mr. Renacci, Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Director Hall for being here. I was a business guy for 30 years. I used to love when the numbers guy came in and talked to me, so I love your numbers. Let's talk about them. Let's go to your numbers. Total revenue over 10 years goes from 3.3 trillion to 5.5 trillion. That shows me an increase of 66%. You don't have to answer that. It's 3.3 to 5.5. You can calculate it at 66%. That's great. In my business world, if you came to me and told me revenues are going to increase by 66%, I'd say we're going to have some record good years. Problem is, mandatory spending goes from 2.519 to 4.524 trillion. That's an increase of 80%. And I would say to you, wow, we got some serious problems. Not in the revenue side because we're growing 60%. We got problems in the spending side because we're growing 80% over 10 years. Again, these are your numbers. The other problem we talk about is growth. And I'm going to ask you a question here. I know you're going to have a long answer on, but growth. We talk about growth. And of course, the tax plan is going to get us some growth. And we say, well, I heard you say just earlier, growth isn't that important in many cases. But I go back to 1996 to 2006, and the average growth rate was 5.52%. That's the reason we balanced the budget. That's the reason we had surpluses. It had nothing to do with anybody sitting around this room or anybody in Congress. We had growth because the economy was booming. It was the tech age. It was a computer boom. I was living it. It was nothing to do. In fact, government even budgeted for $2 trillion in expenses during those periods and doubled their expenses. So Congress just got in the way half the time. It was the economy that was moving. The problem is we keep narrowing ourselves down to the tax cuts. The other side wants to talk about the tax cuts, and let's talk about that. According to your table on table 4.4, page 47, the gross federal debt increases from $21.3 trillion in 2018 to $33.8 trillion in 2028. That equates to an increase of the national debt in that time period of $12.5 trillion. While I disagree to the extent the impact on the debt that H.R. 1 will provide, it does say that H.R. 1 will provide $1.854 trillion to that debt. That's your calculation.
Yes.
That's 15% of the total problem. That's 15% of the total deficit. 12.4 versus 1.854. There's 10.564 in additional debt that's going to occur over the next 10 years that we keep talking about the tax bill. Tell me what you believe is in that 10.564, because that's really the problem. That's the 80% increase. Where are we at, and what's going to cause that?
Well, this is something we've actually been saying for a long time, that the aging population is going to raise spending on the entitlements pretty significantly. It's been coming for a long time. That's the big driver of the increase in the deficit going forward. And part of why I caution about not counting on economic growth is we also have, for the same reason, we have some limitations on our ability to grow the economy because we have an aging population. We're just not going to get that sort of growth in the labor supply that we had at one point.
But you do agree that the aging population, which does contribute to mandatory spending, which does contribute to your numbers going from 2.5 to 4.5 trillion over 10 years, which is an 80% increase, that is dealing, and if this Congress doesn't deal with that mandatory spending number, which really calculates to the, look, it's not the fault of many people here. I call it demographics. We have an aging population bubble that's coming through. Would you agree that that's our biggest problem with our debts and deficits?
Well, that is the biggest reason for why we have a growing deficit. Absolutely.
That's the greatest answer I've heard, and I appreciate that, because too many times people on the other side and even on this side, we talk about taxes. Oh, I just told you our taxes are going up. Our revenue's going up 66%. If I was in business, I'd be slapping you on the back and I'd say, let's go have a beer today because our revenues are going up 66% over the next 10 years. But I really would be saying, where are we going to do to cut this 80% increase in mandatory spending? What do we have to do to cut those numbers? And you just answered it. It's a demographic bubble that we as people here in this budget better start talking about. Now, that doesn't mean, because there'll be somebody on the other side who'll say, Renacci wants to cut Social Security. That's not true. I think that's a program that has to be around. But I think you would also agree that these programs have to be looked at. They are not sustainable. And if we don't look at these programs, we're going to have a massive debt problem. I heard one of my colleagues talking about spiraling debt. God help our children and grandchildren. I say it all the time. I'm concerned for them every day because we can't make the decisions that's necessary to fix this mandatory spending. I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Mr. Carvajal, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Renacci, on the other side's comments. I was just hoping to see him at my Armed Services Committee asking for an audit to finally be done of the Department of Defense, which has never been accomplished to date in the history of our nation. Dr. Hall, thank you for being here and for the nonpartisan good work that the CBO does. CBO's new forecast shows a worsening fiscal outlook for our nation, with a large part due to the recently passed Republican tax plan. The tax bill alone increases our deficits over 10 years by about $1.9 trillion, almost half of our national budget. Is that correct, Dr. Hall?
That's correct.
Dr. Hall, in your analysis of the economic impact of the tax bill, the Republican tax bill, it looks like most of the short-term benefits fade away over time. In particular, on page 115 in the last 4 years of the Outlook window, your table B2 shows that the tax bill will actually reduce our GDP growth rate. Is that correct?
That's right. That's the cycle I mentioned from stimulus being thrown into an economy with near potential.
Thank you. It's troubling that my Republican colleagues insist these tax cuts would pay for themselves, when we can see it's just not true. Meanwhile, later today, the majority plans to vote on a flawed balanced budget amendment. Now that we've thrown our finances out of whack, we want to move forward with a balanced budget amendment. That would lead to deep cuts to Social Security, let me repeat, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. There's no question we need to address our growing debt, and that requires painful trade-offs. Unlike some of my Republican colleagues, I believe that cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to pay for tax benefits that mostly go to multinational corporations and the wealthiest 1% of Americans is not the right priority for our country. Looking at ways that we can grow our economy, Dr. Hall, as a general rule, does immigration tend to increase or decrease our economic growth?
Well, general immigration can raise the labor supply and increase growth.
I want to remind my colleagues that a 2013 comprehensive immigration reform proposal would have reduced federal deficits by $850 billion over 20 years and increased GDP by 5.4% over 20 years. I hope we can consider proposals like this one that would actually make our economic future better. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bratt, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. Thank you for being with us today. Let me ask you a couple questions. In your view, just all else equal, what would generate more economic growth if you reduce taxes $2 trillion or raise taxes $10 trillion?
Well, certainly tax reduction would generate more growth, and that's what we've reflected in our forecast.
Great, and so thank you for that thoughtful, accurate answer. And then secondly, if you imported, in response to the comments on immigration and labor force, I think people have not taken Econ 101. And so it is clearly true, if you imported everyone in the world, right, all 8 billion people into our country, what would happen to economic growth? It would go through the roof. Right. Would anyone be better off?
Right. Well, we wouldn't necessarily have a rise in GDP per capita, I think.
Correct,
where you're
right?
headed.
And so this whole conversation is totally misplaced on labor supply, right? What people care about is income per capita, right? How they're doing. And so the immigration and labor supply, et cetera, is missing the point. I wish my Democrat friends would go back to their buddy and my buddy, JFK, who got tremendous economic growth by focusing on things that matter. Productivity is what matters. That produces per capita growth. Adding more labor supply by itself, it depends. So immigration, if you are pulling in folks that have on average a 10th grade education, what's your guess happens to productivity for the country?
Right. I'm sorry, once more?
On average, the folks that are coming into the country have on average about a 10th grade education.
I see, I
All
got you.
children of God, they're all Catholic brothers and sisters. But what does that do to national productivity on average?
Yeah, it really kind of depends on the mix. Less skilled immigration doesn't add to productivity, more skilled actually does. So that mix is important.
Right, and so I want to get to kind of this year on the spending side has been abstracting from reality in my view. If you look at what happened this year on the Budget Committee, the House did a budget and plussed up the military, nothing else. And we did tax cuts, and I've asked the CBO to score, right? The Chicago guy said the tax cut bill doesn't pay for itself. I think that's true. It pays for maybe a third of it. So, but the Republican agenda with deregulation, et cetera, has produced economic growth that for the past 10 years or so, we've been growing at about 1.5 or 2%, and now we're looking at 3%. Right? After you do tax cuts and get rid of regulation, I don't think there's anything shocking here. The shocking thing is that we did the tax cuts, and the mainstream press, the Democrats discovered this thing called a deficit. But then when we went over to the Senate and we needed 9 Democrat senators, we had to plus up the budget by $400 billion. And not a word on that $400 billion from the colleagues. $400 billion is bigger than $150 billion. And just to show you who we needed to negotiate with, the biggest block of votes on the Democrat side, and this is why I asked you the opening question, the Progressive Caucus got 107 votes for their budget, the Progressive Caucus budget, that raised taxes by $10 trillion, raised spending by $11 trillion, and had more debt and deficit than the Republican agenda when we cut taxes. Right? And so I asked you the question, what would happen to, which is better for growth? Raising taxes $10 trillion, as the other side wanted, or cutting taxes by 1.5 or 2 trillion that we wanted? And now you guys didn't get the growth forecast right. It'd be pretty hard for you to forecast who's going to be president a year out or whatever. But now it seems that the empirical evidence is coming in. And in your view, when consumer confidence is at historic highs, and when business capital investment and business future expectations are at all-time highs, do those two variables usually go along with economic growth in the future?
Right, yeah, they're a sign that consumer spending is going to be strong.
Yeah, and even they're a sign that consumer spending is going to be strong, but consumer spending is passive, right? It's kind of the Keynesian composition of demand, right? And so consumption 70% of demand, blah, blah, blah. Why do consumers have money to spend? Because the business side did capital investment, and what leads to capital investment? Do you think the Republican tax cut policy that allows for immediate expensing is good for capital investment?
Right, yes, I do, and in fact, that's part of our forecast is that we think the part of the Tax Act encourage capital deepening and maybe reduce some distortions.
Yep.
So is giving a boost to this potential GDP. It's one of the reasons why I focused on that.
Right, and in the comments in the right, I wish we had more of the supply side. Some folks on the other side of the aisle like to poo-poo the supply side. Another name for the supply side is business. Everybody in the country that goes to work in the morning at a business is on the supply side. And that's the cause of the growth that allows consumers to spend. In your view, what are in the growth theory, what are the 2 or 3 major variables that cause economic growth?
Well, in the long term, it's almost kind of a simple recipe, right?
Yep.
Labor supply,
right.
Productivity,
Yep.
and then productivity depends upon capital deepening.
Right.
And then you can get things like regulation in there that helps productivity and maybe helps the labor supply too.
Right.
Gentleman's
I think I
time's
ran out of
expired.
time. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sanford from South Carolina is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I suspect that both sides can point plenty of fingers at the other side and aligning blame. But I guess my bigger question is, are we set up for a disaster in financial terms? And so I was jotting down here some notes. If I'm not mistaken, this is an all-time high, peacetime high in terms of debt to GDP numbers that we've never, in our country's existence, seen a higher number. We're in a benign interest rate environment relative to historic patterns. We have an aging population. To a degree, you know, we still have at least a remnant of Pax Americana, maybe not the 1950s or 60s in terms of America's percentage of GDP relative to the rest of the world, but still relatively robust, but it's still a shrinking role relative to the GDP of the world. We have asset inflation, and you could look at that in real estate values, you could look at it P's, you could look at a dividend yield, which I think in part drives consumer spending, which is the wealth effect. We have economic longevity. I think we have the third longest economic recovery in American history going. It's been anemic, hadn't had wide distribution. Maybe it's been more concentrated than we'd like, but it's had duration. You add all those things up, and you say, wow, if something went wrong, it could go really wrong. I guess going back to my colleague from California's point on debt spiral, are we set up for a disaster?
Well, a part of my concern, I've alluded to it before, is we have such a high debt and deficit level right now when the economy is operating near potential. So the concern is, of course, is we won't be operating near potential forever. And when we go through a business cycle, we'll be going through a business cycle where the debt and deficit's starting at a very high level. So if we go through a normal sort of cycle, those numbers could get much worse than we forecast going
Give
through
me
the cycle.
odds.
Sorry?
Odds.
I don't, we try not to do that. A time period where I would be a little worried right now is we're going through a cyclical period with GDP. Right? GDP is now going to be above potential, and we're looking for a soft landing. So
when I look at the kind of ingredients that I looked at here, I don't know of a civilization that has seen a soft landing from this kind of economic unraveling. I mean, if you combine all these different things in with the aging population, with you know, interest rates possibly clicking up. Tell me how many other civilizations have seen soft landings?
I'm not an expert in that, but we're certainly having a lot of faith, I think, in the Federal Reserve's ability to sort of deal with the cyclical aspect.
Yet, if I remember right, back in the 1930s, the Fed's comment at the end of the day was they likened it to, quote, pushing on a string, that there was, in fact, limited effect as to what they could do. Are we not at that same point, given, you know, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Fed's balance sheet has quadrupled over, you know, basically since 2008. We've gone from about $1 trillion in asset base to about $4 trillion in asset base. Are they not quite limited in what they could do going forward?
Well, I tell you what, to me, one of the most encouraging things is expectations on inflation have just remained very calm, around 2%. And that really, what that is that's investor confidence that the Federal Reserve is going to be able to handle things.
I can't remember the name of the gentleman. If I remember right, the name escapes me. But I think his observation, he may have been head of the New York Stock Exchange, he may have been head of the Fed, but his point was stocks had reached a permanent new plateau, and this was 1929, just prior to the crash. Again, these things have a way of unraveling, and I'll come back to that. But I do want to ask one question, going back to the point that was made earlier on the tax and spending front. Our rough back-of-the-envelope number for the last 50 years on spending as a percentage of GDP has been what?
It's been a little over 20%.
Okay. Revenue as a percentage of GDP roughly has been about what?
17 point something percent.
At the end of the tax cut, at the end of the 10-year mark, we'll be at about what?
We'll be at about 18.5 on revenues. Well,
so we'll be about where we've always been for the last 50 years.
And 23.6% on.
So spending is the part that's projected to unravel the budget going forward. Is that correct?
Right, but in both numbers are above the 50-year average. Both numbers are going up. Spending's going up by more.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Hall, let me thank you for your presence here and your repeated presence before the Budget Committee, and to the Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Hall, is this your testimony? You put it in a nice package for us. It looks like It says Keith Hall, Director. Is this the testimony that you submitted?
Yes.
So if I hold this in my hand and begin to read, you would surmise that I'm not making it up as I read it from your testimony.
Yes.
And I thank you very much. I think the responsibility of the American people is to be diligent. But those of us who represent the American people, our responsibility is to be truthful. And as members of the United States Congress, which I tell the children in my district, the most powerful lawmaking body in the world, it is to provide the detailed oversight that is necessary. So let me, first of all, read this, and you just simply say, that is my testimony. As a result, federal debt is projected to be on a steadily rising trajectory through the coming decade. Debt held by the public, which has doubled in the past 10 years as a percentage of gross domestic product, approaches 100% of GDP by 2028. Is that your testimony, sir?
It is.
As I also reflect, so that my good friends on the other side of the aisle, you do have something that says GDP is projected to be greater than CBO. That's a headline. And then you say it's projected to grow more quickly over the next few years. As a result, the levels of those measures are 1.6% higher than CBO previously estimated. So you've got a little bit more growth. Is that, and you wanted to make sure that we knew that you knew that, and the CBO wanted to make that statement. Is that correct?
That's right, in the near term, yes.
And in the near term. Very important point. In the near term. Doesn't say 10 years, 20 years, it says in the near term. And then it says deficits, you've got a headline, so but this is in your statement, deficits are projected to be large by historical standards. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And my surmising is, this is in his testimony, that the tax cut, as have been given as a dupe to the American people, will be about $800 billion deficit in 2018. I'm so glad I voted against it. $1 trillion deficit in 2019, and $1 trillion in 2020, and keep on growing. Now, have you had a chance to look at the tax cut?
Yes, we
The
did
bill.
an analysis of it.
Do you
yes.
recall the corporate tax rate at this time?
21%.
21%, down from?
Used to be a scale, but it was
Yes.
as high as 35%.
Correct. My understanding is, I don't know whether you could affirm this, but let me just say my understanding, my factual understanding is that corporate America said, give us 25%, but might have been able to work with 28%. This tax bill wanted to overdo it on behalf of the American people, screw them out of, in essence, Medicare, destroyed Social Security. They gave 21%. So let me ask you this question, and what that means is that's less income coming into the Treasury. Is that correct?
That's right.
And so working Americans, but poor Americans have a devastating impact by a growing deficit. Do you think so, Mr. Hall?
Well, I think it raises the risk of economic downturns, and economic downturns are very hard on everybody, but it's particularly hard on lower income folks.
Do economic downturns possibly generate loss of jobs?
Yes.
And that would be loss of jobs of individuals who may be hourly workers or temporary workers or just workers in positions that might be considered expendable.
Yes.
And say restaurants close because of the lack of business or the lack of ability to carry the overhead. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. Let me also ask you this question. What have you learned about per capita spending for the Medicaid expansion population, and how have you revised your 10-year estimates for the program since June, which, by the way, go beyond poor people but are elderly in nursing homes, or children with programs that we have touted, but they depend upon Medicaid spending. What have you determined there?
Well, we've recently just lowered our forecast on Medicaid spending since June of 2017, particularly on the expansion states. Spending has been lower than we projected, so we've lowered our forecast going forward.
And you mean you lowered it in terms of it not being available for those individuals who need it?
No, just that the cost to the federal government has been less than we expected.
And what do you attribute to that?
Just costs are lower. It's not, I don't think it's anything particularly with the number of people.
Well, what do you
receiving
project long-term about the viability of Medicaid and being able to pay for those individuals who might need it?
I don't recall offhand what exactly our forecast is, but we do have a forecast going forward on on that.
Let me ask on the record, Madam Chair.
The gentle lady's time is
Let me ask on the
expired.
record to be able to have that from the director, and just say that the frivolity of a balanced budget amendment should have been discussed when my friends passed the frivolous tax cut bill. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentle lady's time is expired. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hall, for being here today. The fiscal year 2018 deficit projections went from $563 billion to $804 billion from the June 2017 CBO report to the April 2018 one. How would you assign liability for this deficit growth among specific legislative, economic, and technical changes?
Most of the increase was the Tax Act. A pretty big part of the increase was also an increase in discretionary spending from the Bipartisan Budget Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act. In fact, the number would have actually, the deficit would have actually improved a little bit if it weren't for those three pieces of legislation.
So the CBO report shows that under current law, the debt held by the public will be 96% of GDP by 2028.
Yes.
If you add the other debt, we're already over 1-to-1 ratio on debt to GDP, aren't we?
Well, that's right. If we look at the other measures.
The intergovernmental debt.
Right.
So when was the last time in our nation's history where our debt has been that large?
It was immediately after World War II. Just one brief period, around 1946, and that's it. That's the only time. And again, one of the things I want to caution is that was a really different time than now, right? We're at a very different time, and I think going forward, it's looking to get larger going forward. I think the trend is upward.
So what would be some potential consequences of having a debt that's equal or above our nation's GDP?
Well, number one is if we have an economic downturn, we'll have much fewer tools in dealing with it. It could be much more severe because we just don't have the tools because we've got so much debt. Second, the chances of a financial market collapse or a financial market problem is higher now than it was before. And it really relies on the federal government's going to continue to borrow. We really rely on people having confidence that the federal government's going to pay them back, right? So this is part that makes it difficult to forecast because who knows when people are going to start asking for a premium from the United States. And then, of course, it restricts your ability, Congress, to do things, right? Discretionary spending is going to be a smaller and smaller part of the budget.
And you may have already covered this, but what's the current interest on the debt payment?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I should know that, but that number's evading me. But we do think the long-term interest rates are going to go up significantly.
Can you get an approximate interest on the debt number?
Well, our 10-year interest rate right now is about 2.4%. And we think it's going to go up to about 3.7% by the end of the decade.
But in dollar values, what's that interest on the debt payment?
I don't know in dollar values. One of the things we do is it's helpful is we look at it. One thing I do have is we have interest payments being about 1.6% of GDP. So that gives you a little perspective about how easy it will be to pay back.
So 1% of GDP.
1.6%, yes.
If I'm saying for every 1%, that's about $200 billion.
Okay.
And 1.6, we're over $300 billion in interest on the debt payment currently.
Sounds right. Yeah, and in 10 years, that interest payment's going to get very close to $1 trillion.
Yeah, and what kind of, how will that affect our ability to fund other government services and the economic outlook of the country if we're paying $1 trillion per year in interest on the debt?
Well, $1 trillion, that's going to be larger. I think I said this before, but I'll repeat it. It's going to be larger than all of defense spending. It will be larger than all of non-defense discretionary spending. So it's becoming a major part.
It will be the largest single expenditure of the federal government will be interest on the debt?
Well, mandatory outlays will still be larger, but
Isn't Social Security the largest one now at just over $900 billion?
Yes.
So when we're talking about interest on the debt at over $1 trillion. So I was looking in the outlays in 2017, 3.982 trillion, 2027, 6.615 trillion. That's 2.633 trillion in 10 years, or 66% increase. If you average it, that's 6.6% per year. Is that what you consider the baseline? And if we reduce that growth, would that be considered a cut?
That's right. That's right. We compare things to the baseline, so we're comparing things to a growing baseline. That's right.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Faso, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Hall, thank you for your service, and thank you for the sobering analysis that you and your staff have provided for us today. CBO is projecting that mandatory outlays for major health care programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance subsidies, and S-CHIP, will total little over $1 trillion in FY18 and almost double to $2 trillion by FY28. What are the largest factors that the CBO is attributing this large increase in federal health care spending?
Well, the number one thing is the aging population. We're just going to have more people who are 65 and older, and of the people who are 65 and older, more will be older.
And that is not a Democrat or Republican, a liberal or conservative factor. That is just plain, simple demographics, isn't it?
It's demographics, and it's demographics that we've seen coming for a long time.
And so other than demographics, what do you attribute that increase in expenditure to?
Well, the second biggest thing is the cost of health care. For decades now, the per-beneficiary cost of health care has been growing faster than GDP. And I'm not sure that we understand that well, but it has been, and so we forecast it'll continue to grow faster than GDP going forward.
Could you attribute a portion of that growth in healthcare expenditures to the fact that we've created since World War II a third-party payment system through insurers where consumers and providers actually don't have an economic relationship to each other?
I mean, that's certainly one of the changes. I'm not an expert in the field, so I don't want to talk too much about what's causing that.
But you're more expert than most.
There certainly has been an increasing federal role in healthcare. And that's become bigger and bigger part of the budget as a result.
And so when we're looking at the means testing programs for mandatory spending, CBO last year told us that this spending grew substantially over the prior decade, doubling from $385 billion in FY 2007 to about $745 billion in FY 2017. What accounts in this area for the most significant growth in mandatory means-tested spending?
I suppose a lot of it still is the aging population part of that. I'm not sure I can answer that really well. I haven't looked at that lately. We did a report last year on it. We haven't updated that. But certainly part of it is still the aging population. Some of it is simply that healthcare costs are rising fast.
Now, when we just had this, the budget agreement that I supported in the House, it was 6 months late. We had passed all the appropriation bills in the House. None had passed the Senate. We wound up in a continuing resolution situation. And that budget that we passed, those spending bills, defense and non-defense discretionary spending, represents about 28% of federal spending. The mandatory Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest, and other mandatory items, I guess, as well in that, represents about 72% of federal spending. How can we better get better public recognition of the fact that, yes, our friends on the other side will blame the tax bill, but so much of the growth in spending is on automatic pilot in Washington. And when Congress is considering and goes through long, extended discussions and continuing resolutions about budgets, we're talking about 28% of spending.
Well, we've been talking about this for a long time. Every year we put out the report and we talk about the role that that mandatory spending is playing not only up to now, but also going forward, becoming a larger and larger share of the federal budget.
And the major factor in this, as you said at the outset, are demographic factors, which have no left or right, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative slant to them. The facts are what they are. The demography of our country is that we're all living longer, and that's great. But the demography is that there aren't enough young people coming in behind us to help sustain the mandatory spending. And that, it seems to me, is the major challenge that we face on both sides of the aisle, getting the public to understand what truly is driving these expenditures.
I think that's correct.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Just to follow up on the line Mr. Faso was talking about, what about prescription drug prices? Isn't that driving a lot of an increase? We've seen a dramatic increase in prescription drug costs as well.
Right, yeah, and that's part of the growing healthcare costs per beneficiary. It just continues to grow faster than GDP.
So the CBO cast doubt on what the GOP tax bill does to support American workers. For corporations, the bill included a tax on global intangible low-tax income. Gilti, G-I-L-T-I, I don't know, and a deduction for foreign-derived intangible income, FDII. So I'm going to read a part of the outlook and then like your help in understanding it.
Sure.
Quote, by locating more tangible assets abroad, a corporation is able to reduce the amount of foreign income that is categorized as GILT. Similarly, by locating fewer tangible assets in the United States, a corporation can increase the amount of U.S. income that can be deducted as FDII. Together, the provisions may increase corporations' incentive to locate tangible assets abroad, unquote. So what are tangible assets, and would that be things like manufacturing equipment and physical factories actually moving?
Right, that's right. Let me be clear, though. One of the things that we're pointing out there is that particular aspect of the Tax Act is complicated, right? It encourages companies to locate in the United States, but there's also this other aspect where it can encourage companies to also locate abroad. So our point there is that's sort of complicated. We think on the whole the Tax Act does encourage locating production in the United States on the whole. But on that particular one, that's, like I say, that one's an example of how sometimes this is more complicated than simply than simply looking at the Tax Act as intended.
But that is a factor. You're saying, so
right.
When CBO says corporations may, quote, locate tangible assets abroad, that could be moving manufacturing and, of course, manufacturing jobs with them overseas. And is that a fair characterization?
Right, yeah, we do say that it may be possible that some companies will do that. We're not saying that that's going to be the rule, but that's a possibility.
Let me see if I've got any more. Maybe I'll yield back. I did want to follow up on some of the questions that I've asked in previous CBO hearings about how the tax bill and changes in agency implementation affects healthcare costs and coverage. So how did CBO's analysis reflect the Trump administration's decision to stop making cost-sharing reductions? If that's been asked already, I can yield, but cost-sharing reduction payments that help keep down health insurance costs.
Well, we did talk about that, but what's happened is insurance companies have raised their premiums for silver plans, and by raising their premiums, it's increased the subsidies they receive from the federal government, and the increased subsidies, tax credits for people, is sort of replacing the direct payment. So the point is that we're still spending money for the CSR, even though we're not making the same direct payments.
So how, let's see. I think I'm going to yield back. I think all those questions have been answered. I appreciate it.
Right.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Lewis, Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Hall. There seems to be some mixed messages here I want to try to drill down on a little bit. I believe in your report, you cite that revenues over the 10-year period will be about $44.1 trillion. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's about $1 trillion more than your previous estimate?
Let me check the.
Before the
number really
Tax Cut and Jobs Act?
Yeah,
There you go.
the change is in revenues.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry to,
Sorry?
yeah, I think,
That's what I might think.
revenues are down about $1 trillion.
It's about $1 trillion.
Yes.
Catching
up to you,
So to
sorry.
what do you attribute the increase in revenues after we passed the tax cut bill to?
Well, it is a decline in revenues, not an increase in revenues.
But the previous estimate was below 44 trillion.
Right.
So are you saying we're getting to 44.1 trillion because of growth?
Well, we have a number of things going on. That's right. We have stronger growth, and stronger growth has added over $500 billion
Okay.
to reducing the deficit, and that stronger growth than we earlier forecast has meant we've had higher revenues.
All right. So
The revenue collection has been
growth
higher.
and revenues are actually higher
Right.
post the Tax Cut and Jobs Act than you had previously estimated
Well, not in our forecast, but in our current level.
at your current level.
Right.
So what do you attribute that to? What was the change from June 17 to June 18 for revenues going to 44.1 trillion and growth going higher?
Well, some of the growth being higher was from the Tax Act. But the primary, overall, the Tax Act lowered revenues.
No, what do you attribute the increase, well, then you say otherwise would be, but if you take a look at the actual revenue tables, they go up every year to 44.1 trillion, which is $1 trillion higher than the previous estimate. And so is growth, and I'm just wondering why you made that change from a year ago.
Right, yeah, I'm not tracking that we've got an increase in revenues over our previous.
we should check on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but
That's quite all right. But you do say there's more growth in the near
Right.
term. All right. So if there's more growth in the near term, but you say it's slower later on.
Right.
To what do you attribute that to? Why does it slow down after?
It slows down because we think real GDP is going to get out ahead of potential. So in other words, we're nearing to where we're at full employment, basically, and we have a lot of stimulus coming in, and so we're going to see an increase in labor force participation. We're going to see more unemployment rate going down, but all this is leading to growth above potential. So what that'll happen is eventually that will increase pressure on prices and then interest rates, and then that.
So if increased growth was a result, at least in the near term, and we have an increase in the deficit of 1.6 to 1.9 trillion, there seems to be some dispute there, but regardless, an increase in deficit, what would the deficit look like if we didn't have the increase in growth?
Well, overall, our change in our economic forecast added $1 trillion to reducing the deficit, so it would be $1 trillion worse.
So because we've got higher growth, we've got a lower deficit.
That's right.
Right. And the higher growth was a change from the previous. I guess where I'm going with this is I'm not quite certain why growth is always considered, well, underestimated in my view, but always considered inflationary. You mentioned the bottlenecks, which is the traditional economic view, and you get a spike in interest rates and a shortage of capital. But you're old enough to remember, I certainly am, when Ronald Reagan took office, the prime rate was 21.5%, inflation was running 13%, came in with Kemp Roth, delayed for a year, but then kicked in. And what happened to interest rates? They were cut in half. How's that possible? You're saying because of this tax cut, interest rates are going up. Well, how did we miss that?
Well, we've got two effects from this tax cut. We do have, part of our forecast, we do have an impact on potential GDP. We do think potential GDP is going to be higher. That's the supply side as a result of the Tax Act. And that will be higher throughout the period.
More capital, more productivity.
Exactly. So we have that happening as well. It's just that there's more stimulus pushing GDP above that outweighs that.
I certainly agree with you to the degree that we think we can prime the pump in consumer spending. That is not pro-growth. What is pro-growth is getting that truck to the truck driver, and that requires capital. Right. And that's what we try to do with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, in my view. Final quick point. Spending growth between 2017 and 2019 is driven in large part by, in fact, the increase in discretionary spending. Is there a danger of us just saying everything the problem is mandatory and we can keep pumping up discretionary?
Well, sure, discretionary spending is contributing, contributor to things.
30%.
Yeah, and, you know, it's gone not noticed, but I can tell you the discretionary spending from the three pieces of legislation increased the deficit by $650 billion.
I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Smucker, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Director Hall. As someone who voted for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I'm very proud of the work that was done and pleased with the impact on individuals that I represent in my district in Pennsylvania. I've heard from countless constituents back in my district about the benefits that they've seen. For instance, using just a first name, Gage from Lancaster County shared, we're a family of 4, and we will use the savings that we've seen towards purchasing our first house. Ken from Chester County shared, my daughter has special educational needs. Although she's only in 2nd grade, my wife and I recognize the value of a strong educational foundation and have enrolled her into a private school where any and all of our savings are going. So it's clear to me, and what I'm hearing from folks across the district, that they're seeing the impact of more money in their pockets, and it's beneficial to them. I've also seen the optimism among businesses. And a quote from your report says that the recently enacted tax law, and I quote, will encourage workers to work more hours, businesses to increase investment in productive capital, thereby raising employment and raising income. We're seeing an impact on wages today?
Yes.
And how much do you expect we'll see wages be impacted?
Yeah, you know, I don't have an estimate on the wages, but I can tell you about employment. We think employment's going to be an average of 1.1 million higher over the 10-year period because of the Tax Act. So
that's where I was going next. So we're not only seeing more money in individuals' pockets today, but we're seeing wages rising for the first time in a while, or more than we had seen in the past. And we'll see 1.1 million, that's what you just said, 1.1 million more jobs created over the next 10 years as a direct result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
Yes.
One of the things I'm now hearing, and I just recently met with a group of large staffing companies. So these are companies that are working with businesses to fill available spots. And the availability of individuals to fill that spots has reached almost a crisis point for a lot of businesses. And I guess I'd like to hear from you whether you are seeing that as well. Going down, what are you projecting the unemployment will go down to?
You know, I don't have in front of me, but it will go down. It's already very low. We do have it going down a bit lower. And we do think
to about 3.3%?
That sounds about
like
right,
that?
Yeah.
Which is historically very low, right?
Right. Well, it's already historically low.
Right.
3.3% would be very low.
So what I've heard from these individuals, and this is anecdotal, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this, you know, businesses are ready to reinvest back into building factories and creating jobs here, but literally today still are forced to make decisions about where they'll locate a new plant or where they'll locate their operations based on available workforce. Do you think your report bears that out, or what you understand about the labor supply bears that out?
Yeah, it does and it should. I mean, we've started to see some modest increases in wages, and we think that's going to accelerate. We are going to get much stronger wage growth in the next few years. So that is absolutely true, and that's a big part of getting the slack out of the economy.
So
right?
Do you think that lack of labor availability will impact economic growth over the next 10 years?
Well, I think it will. I think it's going to encourage labor force participation over what
and I'd like
would
to
have
get
been
to that. I'm
without
sorry,
it.
I'm running out of time. So can you 62% labor force, or 63% is current labor force participation rate. Can you give us some historical perspective on that?
Well, it's already a little bit of a low level, and it's a low level because we have an aging population. And the long-term trend actually for that is it's going to go down as people age out. But what will happen from the tax bills, we will get some stimulus. We will have that not decline so fast as it was before, and it'll hold up, we think, as a result.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity, and I wish I had a little more time to talk with it, but I've felt, businesses are saying this is a very real problem. They can't find available spots. Is there an opportunity to build more participation in the labor workforce? I've always felt like we haven't made that connection very well, providing the skills training and so on to connect people with the jobs that are available. Is there an opportunity for us there?
Oh, I think that's true, yes, because I do think the aging population means that if we can focus on the not aging population and get their participation rates up, that could make a difference. Historically, for some reason, the cohorts below the baby boomers have not participated in the labor force like baby boomers have, and that's a little puzzling.
Yeah, thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hall. It's always good to see you here. If I wasn't unquestionably positive about life in general, I may have a darker view just listening. But let me ask you a question. Considering all the factors that have been discussed today, are we as a country, to use an old quote, damned if we do and damned if we don't?
I think there are some important trade-offs that need to be made. I think the rising debt is going to be a challenge if it's not dealt with. And in a sense, there's going to be a price to pay in dealing with that.
Okay, so the old saying, life is a series of trade-offs.
Right.
From beginning to end. That, and kind of rhetorically speaking here for a second, how do we, as the elected, officials, if you will, elected by the people to come here, how do we, in our deliberations and our performance, build confidence in the American people that their government will do the right thing if left to its own devices? Kind of, again, rhetorically speaking. T.S. Eliot has got a lot of quotes, but one is that only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. So when we talk about the future, we predict to an extent, but when you think of the future, you just mentioned a second ago about the post-baby boomer generations being less motivated to participate in the workforce. I find that interesting. I wasn't given an option as a kid of participation. My parents explained to me what my participation would be. They left it up to me to the level and the quality which they watched very closely. But in the future of jobs and careers, who do you think is better at predicting and adapting to the future? Government or business, or said public versus private sector?
Well, I personal opinion, private sector.
Okay, so when you take something like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and put more money into the private sector hands, how should the government then evaluate that money that goes back into, if you will, corporate coffers is just one thing, but that small business coffer? How does government then evaluate what they did, what we did?
Well, I'm not sure I can tell you how to evaluate it. I can tell you that we'll do our best to sort of describe what we think is going to happen and what the trade-offs are.
So maybe we set, because, and I agree with you, by the way, we can't really evaluate, but if we have an idea of metrics and milestones, that then as we go forward, we go, okay, we were close on this, we were off on that, here was a positive, here was a negative. That is a way for government to, if you will, evaluate its laws and its policies.
Yes.
Because when you make a law, it's for 100%. When you make a policy, it's for, at best, 84.6% on the statistical average, because you got a bell curve, and that's policy. So when we, the CBO report shows that mandatory spending continues to escalate due to demographic changes and other factors, and in fact, spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and net interest is due to double between now and FY 2028, can any serious effort to reduce our growing deficit and debt problems exclude reforms to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid?
Well, that's getting a little dangerously close to recommendations for us. I can tell you, you do need to look at the size of changes you can make, right? You need pretty significant change. You kind of need to go where the money is.
And I guess, thank you, I see my time's about to run out, but is it fair to say that everyone needs to have skin in the game in order for us to make the tough decisions? The answer is yes, because anybody who doesn't have skin in the game is not fully invested, and I yield back, sir.
I'll take that.
The gentleman from Alabama has reappeared, and he's recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Palmer.
Can I have 15 minutes? I'm kidding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple of questions, Mr. Hall. I think earlier Congresswoman Black asked about the new baseline being altered for the CSR payments.
Right.
And I've asked that this be handed out. In June 17, you were projecting $44 billion savings, but you were anticipating that these payments would be made. Why did you change that?
I'm
the
sorry.
Baseline. You raised the baseline.
And this is the direct payments for the CSRs?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, that's not in the baseline now because there are no direct payments being made. But what we've adjusted is we've adjusted the tax credits that people get because insurance companies, in response to not getting the direct payments, have raised premiums. And they're now people are receiving increased tax credits. So that's how the federal government is paying for it now.
Section 257B1 of the Graham-Rudman-Hollins Act requires budget scorekeeping agencies to assume that funding for entitlement authority is adequate to make all payments required by those laws.
Right.
In other words, you would have had to get an instruction to do that. You don't have I don't think you have the authority to do that without.
Well, we do. Again, we do have payments. The CSR, funding for the CSR is in our baseline. It's just in a different spot. It's not the direct payments. It's through the higher premiums and the subsidies for those.
All right. I'm sorry I've had to miss most of this. I've been trying to keep up with what's going on, but in some of the discussions, and I just got a little bit of Mr. Bergman's questions, your answer to that about skin in the game and where we are in terms of getting to a balanced budget. It's kind of a hot topic today with the balanced budget amendment coming up. One of the questions I'd like to ask you is, does the CBO anticipate a reduction in uncollected tax revenues as a result of the tax reform bill that we passed? Because I believe the projection for uncollected taxes last year or this year, last year was like $450 billion. I want to emphasize $450 billion with a B.
Yeah, you know, I don't know offhand. I'd have to talk to our tax folks, and maybe I can get back to you about
Well,
what our
considering
assumption
that's
is.
almost half the deficit, wouldn't that be relevant?
Well, sure, and I'm pretty sure it's in our forecast. I just don't know the number offhand.
I'd be interested to know if that's in the forecast.
Right.
That was one of the objectives of the tax reform, was to simplify the tax code that would eliminate, substantially eliminate the failure to collect all the taxes that are owed the federal government. There's also the issue, and I just left the hearing in the Oversight Committee on improper payments. That's 140 plus billion a year. It's going up every year. This committee last year included in our budget reducing that by half. That's 700 billion. The point I want to make is, and really that we can get to a balanced budget. The issue is, do we have the courage to tell the American people the truth about where we are in terms of our fiscal condition, and make recommendations that will get us back where we need to be to get our fiscal house in order. but that includes collecting all the taxes. That means taking advantage of our energy resources. That means eliminating improper payments. I pointed out that in 2015, we collected $516 billion just in fees. If we could collected another 16 or 17 billion in fines, if we captured just 10% of that, that's 50+ billion per year. Do you believe that we could get to a balanced budget?
I think it would take some very difficult decisions and take some planning. But of course, I think it's possible. It's certainly certainly above my pay grade as to how to do that. But we can
If it's
certainly.
above your pay grade, that's kind of depressing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Not recognizing anyone that hasn't had a chance to grill the CBO director, or at least question him, I'm going to yield the remaining time to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much again, Dr. Hall, and you spent a lot of time, you and your team, here before this committee over the last few months, and we appreciate all of your time and your responses. I want to talk about your unemployment projections for a minute. The unemployment rate's been steady at 4.1% for several months now, and which is pretty remarkable stability during a time when we've had strong job creation. And it's a level that not too long ago was thought to be unachievably low, and most people are characterizing us as being at full employment at this level. But your report forecasts a dramatic reduction to an average of 3.8% this year and 3.3% next year. Since we already have one quarter at 4.1%, getting to 3.8% for the year would require we have about 3.5% average for the rest of the year. And one reason we've seen the unemployment rate hold steady, even through strong job creation, is through growth in the job force, labor force. Your projections also call for a higher labor force participation rate than you have projected in the past. And finally, you have the unemployment rate climbing from 3.3% to 4.6% in 2022, which is a rather unusual rate, it seems like, while the economy continues to expand. So I'm interested, again, not to try to make any point, I'm just curious as to if you would walk us through your unemployment projections and explain how and why you expect the changes that you have projected.
Sure. It's the cyclical pattern from the stimulus. We've had a lot of stimulus into an economy near potential. So what we're essentially forecasting is that growth will get above potential, and what that means then is employment will actually get above potential, and the unemployment rate will get below potential. And by potential, we mean sustainable. So while the unemployment rate may get to a lower level, as we think it will, we don't think that's sustainable. So we think that will lead to inflationary pressures to raise interest rates, and that will lower economic growth, slow down wage growth, and make the unemployment rate go back up towards its sort of more permanent, sustainable level.
Okay. Now, in terms of, I think you just said a few minutes ago that you're projecting about 1 million new jobs because of the tax cuts, right. A little over 1 million new jobs because of the tax cuts. And I'm curious about the model because most of the analyses so far, done studies of corporate America and so forth, is that the vast majority of the tax cuts given to corporations are going to be spent on dividends, stock buybacks, and mergers and acquisitions, none of which result in additional capital formation. I mean, I guess you could argue the dividends might, but probably not. And a very small percentage, about 20-something% of all of the corporate tax cuts, the business tax cuts, actually go to reinvestment and to employees. So I'm just curious as to whether those are similar to the way you viewed the way tax cuts are going to be used, or if you had a different analysis of that.
Well, we do think that the Tax Act will lower the user cost of capital, and it will essentially lower the marginal tax on capital, and that will encourage companies to increase their investment. Similarly, we think that the marginal tax on labor will be lower going forward, making it easier for companies to bring labor on. Those are the things that affect our view of potential GDP. But then we also have this stimulus coming in. We have a lot of aggregate demand coming in, pushing the economy above its potential for a while. So, for example, if you look at that, our estimate that employment would be 1.1 million higher over a 10-year period, that's on average over the 10-year period. In fact, the employment level will probably be higher in the middle before the inflationary pressures kick in and interest rates go up and sort of take some of that stimulus away.
Okay. Turning to another subject, your report includes extensive analysis of the economic impact of the tax bill, and as we just discussed, predicts strong economic growth this year and next year. Of course, we've been experiencing long economic expansion, soon to be the second longest in our history. But too many parts of the country, particularly in rural areas and older industrial cities, have not shared in the benefits of the expansion so far. And I think it's a concern that that trend may continue over the next few years. So my question is, have you done any analysis of whether the near-term economic boost from the tax law will be broadly shared across the country? Is there any reason to think that the law's benefits will make a significant or transformative difference in communities with weaker economies, or is it more likely that the benefits will be concentrated in areas that already have healthy economies?
Yeah, we just haven't been able to think about that at all. We've been so focused on the big budgetary impact and the economic impact that's significant extra analysis to try to look at that.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that. So as you know, we are going to be debating and voting on a Balanced Budget Act amendment this afternoon. And one of the things that concerns me about that whole idea is, there are a lot of things, but one of the things that concerns me most is that if you had that proposal in effect right now, we'd be looking at figuring out how to cut roughly $800 billion worth of federal spending in the next year, roughly 20% of the 20% cuts in all federal spending. I'm curious as to whether you could make an estimate as to what impact on the economy a loss of $800 billion in federal spending, and whether it's in jobs or so forth. What would be the impact of that kind of a cut?
Well, of course, it depends a lot on the details, you know, how much time and that sort of thing. But certainly a drop in revenue would be the opposite of stimulus. A drop in federal spending would slow down the economy, just something that large.
And since, you know, in my state, federal contributions to our state budget amount to about 37%. So everything that goes through the state government, and I'm not even thinking about local governments, but the state government, it's 30% of all expenditures. So it would have a cut of that magnitude in federal spending, or anything approaching that. In your opinion, would that have a significant impact on state budgets throughout the country and local budgets as well?
Well, sure, but of course it depends upon how it's done. But if you're talking about just a one-time dramatic cut, you know, one of the things that certainly happens with federal budgets is there's a cyclical aspect to it. So when you go into a recession, revenues go down, spending goes up, and that has an impact on helping stabilize the economy going forward.
Yeah, and just to go back to one of the prior questions, you were asked about basically the income-based spending, how why it spiked from 2007 for those 10 years. A good proportion of that growth in income-based spending would have had to do with the recession, would it not have?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Just wanted to clarify that. I have no further questions. Once again, I thank you very much for your efforts and your responses, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We have one other member that has arrived here toward the end of our meeting that I'll yield to, Mr. Grossman of Wisconsin.
Okay, first of all, thanks for coming over here. I have a goal of this committee is to propose a given amount of discretionary spending. And I believe originally President Trump last year proposed about a 5.5% increase in defense discretionary spending and a cut in non-defense discretionary spending. Is that accurate?
I believe that's right.
Considerable. Instead, what happened, in part because of this committee's action and in part because of pressure from Democrats in the Senate, there was a significant increase in non-defense discretionary spending. Is that accurate?
It is.
Significant. You know how much more we spent in non-defense discretionary than President Trump originally wanted?
I can tell you on our 10-year forecast, because of the three bills, discretionary spending's up by about $650 billion.
Yeah, and can you tell us what the difference in non-defense discretionary is considered to be now compared to what President Trump originally proposed a year ago?
Yeah, I don't. I just don't remember what the proposal was that well.
It was a significant cut, right? About 6%. I shouldn't say 6% is significant. I mean, all sorts of people have been on the 6% cuts all the time. It was about 6.5%, right? Could you comment on what I think is rather bizarre policy that is growing in Congress, that if we needed an increase in defense spending, we have to spend more in non-defense spending to be fair?
Well, CBO, we would not want to comment on what is or isn't fair.
Well, what do you think is the long-term fiscal effect of the idea that if somehow this body believes that we need to spend more on defense, we have to go up in non-defense as well? Could you tell us what the difference is between what your deficit looks like 5 or 8 years out now compared to if this body would have gone along with President Trump's recommendation a year ago?
I can't so much, and one of the things that's important about our forecast here is we follow the Budget Committee direction on discretionary spending. Because it's discretionary, it's Congress's choice, we make a very mild assumption that discretionary spending grows by inflation, except, of course, for the caps. So we're really not even forecasting what's going to happen with discretionary spending. We're just making a very benign assumption.
Are you basing it on, though, the current omnibus then plus inflation for the next few years? Is that what you're basing it on?
Well, that's right. The current omnibus changes the caps.
Correct.
And once the change in the caps, once they go back into place, then the caps are holding things back. And once the caps are gone, then we have inflation driving discretionary spending.
So in other words, right now you are anticipating a cut in non-defense discretionary 2 years out?
Yes.
Okay.
It's one of the reasons why we have an alternative fiscal scenario in here, where we assume roughly, rather than constant current law, we have current policy. So we sort of assume that the caps don't readjust. We assume that the drop in the individual income tax rate doesn't go back up, and give you an idea of what that looks like going forward.
Could you then, I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you, let's take a number 4 years out or whatever. Can you tell us what you're anticipating in both defense and non-defense discretionary compared to the current year? Pick say 5 years out, something.
Yeah. We have a nice chart that doesn't put it in dollar numbers, but we have it in terms of percent of GDP. So right now, for example, defense spending is about 3.1% of GDP. Mm-hmm. And under current law, that's going to go down to 2.6% of GDP in 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's in our forecast. And then for non-defense, it goes from 3.3% to 2.8%. So we have discretionary spending growing slower than GDP.
And you can't translate that, I suppose you could if I gave you the time, but you can't translate that into a nominal dollar amount?
No, we can follow up, though, and give you the dollar amount.
I'd like to know that, so we know what we're shooting at. And I also wonder if, I think President Trump, before he maybe listened to Congress too much, what he would have liked those numbers to be say 5 and 10 years out in nominal terms. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Because I didn't use all of my time in the beginning, I just want to close with a couple of observations. Been a lot of discussion in here about various impacts of what the Congress does, taxes and so forth, and its implication for the long-term fiscal condition of the country, i.e. deficits continue to rise, debt continues to rise to unsustainable levels as a percentage of GDP. And there have been attempts made to make the villain in this whole thing the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and then occasionally other things like increases in defense spending or increases in non-defense discretionary spending. So I just have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Hall. Is it fair to just basically single out one part of the economic condition and paint with a broad brush on that? I.e., put another way, shouldn't the Congress look at economic output as a whole, i.e., lower taxes, maybe a lower regulatory framework that businesses and industry have to live under? I mean, it goes without saying that a business or an industry that thinks that there's going to be a hyper-regulatory environment is probably not going to want to expand and introduce new products and those kinds of things because of the fear of the unknown, the regulatory pressures that may be coming. Mandates on health care certainly impact decisions made about whether to grow and expand an economy. I think that all of those things go right to the heart of consumer confidence, and consumer confidence is a big piece of whether people spend money and live their lives in a little different way. I also believe that the policies of this Congress, particularly those on means-tested programs, have an impact overall on the budget. So I guess the point I'm making is this, and some of these things you can score, and some of these things are difficult to score at best, that can we not just say that an economy that is built around a lower tax framework, a lower regulatory environment, fewer mandates from the federal government, maybe a little more empowerment to our states to be able to solve some of the problems that we try to solve at the federal level, wouldn't that have a real nice impact on the economic productivity of this country in such a way that it could one day help us rid ourselves of the deficits, particularly if we were able to do things like my friend Gary Palmer suggests, go after a lot of these improper payments and make people more accountable again. The unknown about the Tax Cut Jobs Act, that we know that when we simplify that, people then are more predisposed to doing their taxes accurately so that we don't have taxes that should be due and payable certainly unaccounted for. Shouldn't we look at that as a whole? Shouldn't the Congress consider that as a whole?
Well, I'm first going to start by not making a recommendation, but I'll say that all those things do in fact impact the budget outlook and the economic outlook. Those are all important factors that do affect, I think, the outcomes going forward.
And I think the last thing I want to say is this, and I said this earlier in my remarks. There's been a lot of discussion on both sides of the aisle about the omnibus package and a lot of comments about discretionary spending. We hear it back in our districts, and sure, they do impact. But overall, as I said earlier, when you see the aggregate numbers on discretionary spending trekking higher, but its percentage of GDP trekking lower, it sends, I think, a very loud and strong message to the Congress that if you are going to get your arms around the deficits and the debt, you are not going to be able to ignore in the process what's going on the side of the ledger that is by law, that is autopilot, that we call mandatory. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. And thank you, Mr. Hall, Dr. Hall, for your attendance, not only here, but for the previous 5 hearings that you and your staff have been available to answer our questions and stand in front of that sit in front of that microphone. With that, please be advised, members, you can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing. Any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. And with that, this committee stands adjourned.